In this tutorial, I'm going to review how to use biological diagram templates for PowerPoint. After downloading the biological diagram template files, you will see that there are 3 file types, 2 Adobe Illustrator files, 1 compressed zip file with individual SVG files, and this PowerPoint file. So let's start by opening this PowerPoint file. An important thing to note as you open this is that this PowerPoint file represents all of the individual images in the biological diagram template color Adobe Illustrator file, and they're already pre-exported as PNG files with transparent backgrounds that allow you to take the backgrounds as well as all of the individual cell types. So there's lots of background styles, there's DNA styles, there's arrow styles, and all of the individual cell types and illustrations that are in that file. You can see here that I've kept them in this templated form where you can create your own PowerPoint illustrations if you're not as adept at using all of these individual illustrations in Adobe Illustrator yet. So let's go back to the top and review a little bit more about this file. One important thing to know is that this file is formatted so that it is 180 by 140 millimeters, so 180 millimeters wide, 140 millimeters tall. And you can adjust this in the page setup, which this is the same millimeters represented in inches. But just know that the reason why I've set this as a setting is because this is a typical maximum 2-column width for a figure. So again, if you aren't comfortable making full figures in Adobe Illustrator yet, but you can sort of use it to create your own custom shapes that you then use PowerPoint to format your figures, you can take this file, save as, and save this file as a figure draft that is already formatted to be the appropriate size for where each slide is the appropriate size for an individual figure, knowing that it doesn't have to be 140 millimeters tall. That's sort of an arbitrary. It could be much shorter. It could be a full page length depending on your needs, but it's the right width, so it's a great starting point to format your figure. We'll just call this figure test and save. And the way I'm going to recommend using this if you want to format your figures in PowerPoint using the biological diagram template is to have one file where you're going to create your figure and then have that template file unchanged where you can pull all the assets from it as a separate file side by side. So by the end of this tutorial, we are going to create and use this cellular background to create an illustration that represents some cell signaling. But we'll get into this in a little bit in the tutorial. That'll be the last thing we look at. The first thing I do want to do is make sure I review what is in this PowerPoint file. And that's just starting by saying, again, all of those individual illustrations that you see in the Adobe Illustrator file are placed here with transparent backgrounds. You can see everything in here has a transparent background and can be used to create custom designs. Now let's take a minute to review all of the illustrations on these slides, starting with these cellular backgrounds that come in multiple styles and colors. So as I scroll through, I'm not going to click on every slide, but you can see that there's a lot of different styles and colors, and this can help you format your illustration in PowerPoint. For example, let's say if you wanted this cytoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, nuclear pore, nucleus background to be used and fill it in with some sort of biological diagram, you could actually fully format your figure into your PowerPoint file, and you could even format it for publication in a scientific journal. Just keep in mind you have to use whatever that scientific journal's preferred font styles and sizes are, but this could be a great way to, if you're not familiar with using Adobe Illustrator or Affinity Designer or other vector tools for your figures, you can use this to create very professional figures, add your data and other important information to then export each of these slides as perfectly formatted individual figures. And again, there's lots of different file sizes and types with styles of vesicles. There's blood vessel backgrounds, lipid bilayers, epithelial cell layers. And keep in mind, you don't have to use, these are images, but you don't have to use exactly what I've given you. For example, you could crop this image and have it be a representation of a normal epithelial cell layer versus a diseased or red epithelial cell layer. So there are some things you can do to customize this, even though in PowerPoint itself, you can adjust the individual points. You can adjust many things to create good illustrations, even if you're not using a vector editing tool. There's lots of versions of DNA and arrows. Keep in mind, these arrows are images that can be used in your illustrations within PowerPoint, but you may want to be using PowerPoint arrows instead if you are going to submit this for publication within PowerPoint, simply because you have more control over things like the exact length of the arrow. But these are still helpful. You may even find these useful and use only the image arrows in your designs. There's a nice representation of how you might want to even use some of these backgrounds provided. So again, I tried to do the most common biological backgrounds you may need. And the slides also include representations of an animal cell, plant cell backgrounds, a plant cell illustration, and many different cell types that are ready for use in your designs. And there's even a cancer cell biology illustration showing normal cells, normal and cancer cells, and increasing numbers of cancer cells to represent tumor biology. There's a lot of organelles, so there's the Golgi apparatus, there's extracellular matrix, apoptosomes, mitochondria, and other important symbols that you may consider using in your designs. And finally, we also have a lot of DNA, histone options for the most commonly used biological diagrams that you may need. Now I'm going to pause at this next slide of the color palettes because there are a few things you need to know about the color palette that I've provided here, which is that there are 3 main color schemes that have already been pre-tested for color accessibility. And so when you want to use a red and blue and yellow and teal color scheme, I highly recommend using this bright or dark color palette that have already been tested so that people with color blindness won't have issues distinguishing between these colors. That's the same for this blue, orange, purple, and gray color palette, as well as this pink, green, brown, and gray color palette. So this is just helpful to know that that's how these are segregated and why they are arranged how they are. And this color palette is very useful in vector editing tools, but it's also useful in PowerPoint. And I want to show you a quick tip about its power, where even though this is one single image, this image can be used in adding shapes and colorizing different shapes that you may be using in your own designs combined with my designs, because all of my designs are using this bright color scheme and mostly using these sets of gradients, where let's say you wanted to add a shape that matches that same color scheme. You can be using the PowerPoint color tool. So if I use no outline and I want this cell to either have a gradient or even just a single fill color, I can choose the colors, choose the eyedropper, and have it match the exact shades of red in my designs. I can use the gradient to use that same kind of red to represent more closely the gradients I have shown on my designs. So it's just something to be aware of. This is still a very powerful tool, even though you're going to have to use the eyedropper tool to pull in these other colors. And we'll use this in example shortly after I complete the review of the remaining slides, which the remaining slides show the signaling shapes in each of these 3 color schemes. So starting with this blue, yellow, teal, and red color scheme, this is sort of a random selection of the shapes available in my Adobe Illustrator file, so randomly selected for colors. And it applies this color scheme so that it's all consistent. And keep in mind, if you wanted, let's say you really wanted not to have a red and green, but you wanted this exact shape to be a blue or your own color, that is where you're going to need to open either the SVG file or the Adobe Illustrator file to edit and export this exact same image. But you can still even just use the images I've provided here to create some pretty impressive designs. We have the second color palette showing the same exact type of output with these cellular signaling molecules, as well as these more complex signaling molecules. And finally, the third color palette in that same design. Now that we've reviewed the file, let's use the images to make a custom illustration. So if I go back up to the top, I'm actually going to take this entire figure test file and I'm going to delete all of these little representative illustrations. I'm going to delete this one and I'm going to work with this specific template background, and I'm going to open back up my original template file, and I'm going to use this to pull all of the images into this diagram to create my diagram. So the first thing I want to decide is what to illustrate, and I think for this illustration I'm going to go ahead and just choose to make it a pretty simple signaling pathway, and I might choose a ligand channel opening. So what I need to do is decide which of these color schemes I want to use. And I think I'll go ahead and use this blue, purple, orange, gray color scheme. And to have a ligand opening a channel, I may just want to choose between something like these 4 designs, where here's 2 different types of channels, a closed and an open channel, closed and an open channel. I could also use some of these signaling molecule combinations, but for now I'm going to go ahead and choose this channel, which represents a good ligand gated channel, and I'll copy these 2 and paste them onto my file, and I'll resize it. I can either resize the background to create my illustration, or I can resize these individual illustrations. And as you can see on the left, we'll maybe have a closed channel representation of what happens in this biological diagram versus an open channel. And as part of a ligand gated channel, we're going to need a ligand. So I'm going to go back to the same color scheme, and I'm going to choose a different color to stand out. I'll maybe choose a purple or an orange, maybe this purple. And in order to get this purple dot, I'm going to copy and paste this entire channel combo, paste it, and I'm going to go ahead and just crop the circle from this diagram and use this as the pore to open. And at this point, I do want to point out that even if this is my ligand and I'm using just this templated image, this is another point where if you insert a shape, this could be another way to just create the custom designs that you want that don't rely on what I've specifically exported here. So this could be something where you create a circle shape, you go ahead and take this fill, let's see, I have to expand this to see all my options. Take this fill color, go to more colors, and have my color palette open. In fact, when I'm working on an illustration, what I'll often do is I'll have either within the same file or created in the file I'm working, I'll just have a copy paste of the color palette. And even if I know I'm going to be just working with one specific color palette, maybe I'll even just segment it right here to know these are really the colors I want to work with that are already pre-designated as great and not going to cause any issues for colorblind people. And I'll use the more colors option, get the eyedropper tool, and let's say I can have this be a purple, dark purple that stands out. I can have it be a lighter purple or even a gradient. And I could have an outline or not. It's up to you. I'm going to go ahead and stick with my copy pasted file. I think that's what looks best. But you can start to learn how to use these templates yourself to see what designs you like to use best for you. And I'm going to use this PowerPoint circle instead as the molecule that's going to go through my channel. So I'll make this much smaller to fit through the pore of my channel. And I'm going to change the color then to match the color of the pore, just so that they can kind of align, right? What goes through the pore should be something similar to the pore color, maybe dark or even a little lighter. Using my color selection tool, making it easy on me to pick colors that I know are gonna go perfectly well. And I'll go ahead and copy and paste this, arrange them to go directly as something that is going through my open channel. And now, to be more clear about the fact that this is now open and something is going through the channel and into this cell, I'm going to pull in an arrow. And I can do this by creating an arrow in PowerPoint or choosing from my images on this template. So let me go ahead and go to the arrow section, and I'll select an arrow. I'll rotate it, resize it a little bit, and show that these molecules are going through the pore. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so I can be a little more accurate. My placement. Might even also increase the size of the channel just a touch. Great. Resize this to center it and show that these molecules are going through the channel pore. And I'm also going to, now that I'm zoomed in, notice that the outlines for these are a little bold. I'm going to change to 0.5 font. That looks much better. Okay, so we have a molecule going through this open pore, and as a biological diagram, typically something happens after something goes through the pore. So for example, I'm just going to make a very simple example. Let's say one of the potential pathways for this, and I'll use a dotted arrow to show that, is that it could affect gene expression pathway by interacting with a protein. So I can pick an interaction with a protein. I'll make this a little bigger just to match the other arrow style. And again, I won't have this same problem in sizing if I were using the shapes for arrows directly in PowerPoint, but this is just going to be an example showing just the images. And I will go ahead and now go back to my template file and pick from this color scheme something that will represent a transcription factor. So let's pick an orange, because this is sort of a different mechanism. I'm going to pick an orange rectangle. I'm going to expand it, maybe make it a little longer. And to make it clear that this is affecting gene expression or that this is a transcription factor, I can obviously add text, but I'm also going to want DNA. So if I go up to my DNA templates, let's see, let's pull in this image of DNA, and we can copy paste, add it to the file, and show that it's binding to DNA. And to even be more clear that it's expressing something, we can add another arrow. We can add text. And as you can see, this is turning out to be a nicely formatted illustration. You could have any sort of gene expression. You can add a lot more molecules and details to be specific about what kinds of genes. Again, keep in mind, you're going to want to format, if this is for a journal, you will want to format it using their specific requirements for font sizes. But this is a good start. This can be something where you can talk more about the closed pathway of what's happening. And let's say you have a lot of excess background in the end and you want to get rid of it. You can easily just get rid of it by cropping this background to more closely represent the area that you're going to use for the illustration. Crop this a little more on the bottom. And now we have a pretty good representation of a closed pore, an open pore, and channel signaling diagram that was made just using what's available on this template file. And the final thing I want to point out with these PowerPoint files is that even if you're not quite comfortable editing in a vector software yet, having these files, such as the zip files of the zip folder that opens up the SVG files, you can have a lot of power to start to learn how to use vector tools and incorporate them into your PowerPoint designs as you learn more about how to directly edit in things like Adobe Illustrator and Affinity Designer, and using these SVG files to then edit things in other software like Inkscape, because these are the files you can use to truly customize every aspect of your designs, including things like the cell shape and locations. There's full edit capabilities when you begin to learn something like Adobe Illustrator or Affinity Designer, and you can start to with these files as you begin to see the power of taking these individual vector points and making every cell shape that you can possibly imagine, every cell color that you can possibly imagine, and have full ability to create your own designs over time. You've now reached the end of this tutorial on how to use the PowerPoint file in the biological diagram template, and I hope you learned a lot about how to use and create your own custom designs in PowerPoint. Thanks for watching and have a great day.